Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Karen Lee, and I'm an optometrist that used to do a lot of specialty lenses. We're here today, brought to you by your friends at the National Keratoconus Foundation with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Maria Walker, who is going to discuss what is midday fogging and how to remedy it. A little bit about Maria. I can't think of a better person to give this topic. She studies midday fogging and the tear reservoir all day long. She is a researcher with a PhD and an OD, currently working at the University of Houston. Prior to joining them there, she actually did her residency the same year as me at Pacific University in Oregon and went to optometry school at NECO in New England. So Maria, we'd love to hear everything about this topic today. Take it away.
Sure. Thank you for that nice introduction, Karen, Dr. Lee. We miss you at the University of Houston. So yes, I am going to talk today about midday fogging in scleral lenses, really kind of what is it and how do we mitigate it. So of course, this is aimed for y'all as patients. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, and I already told Karen to interrupt me if there's any burning questions, but we are going to take a couple of breaks to answer some questions. So I know there's a few questions related specifically to this topic, but also on some other things. So don't worry, we have an hour here, but you will get my email at the end. So if there's like a burning question that anybody has and you don't get a chance to ask it, feel free to email me. I'll give Karen's email address to you too. You can email her and ask her all of your questions. She misses seeing patients, so she'll like it. So just in general, scleral lenses, and you all probably wear scleral lenses or are thinking about wearing scleral lenses, so you may know this, but when we're teaching students about these lenses, of course, this is just kind of an animation here on the bottom, patient wearing a lens. It sort of extends, so it's a large diameter rigid lens. So many of you probably previously or may even now wear the smaller diameter, like we call them corneal lenses. They sit here on the colored part of the eye, which we call the iris. So scleral lenses sit out on what's called the sclera, and the conjunctiva is the tissue that overlies that. So this animation up top in the right can kind of help you appreciate what we see and what is actually going on with the sort of anatomy beneath the lens. So you have this lens here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. Karen will probably tell me if you can't, but even if not, you can see there's an arrow pointing to scleral lens here, and it's vaulting. So essentially vaults over the cornea, which is that front sort of clear dome-shaped part of the eye, and lands on the white part of the eye, or the conjunctiva. So just for a little bit of reference, this animation that just popped up here, this is essentially an animation of the eye, right? So this is the nerve kind of leading back to the brain. So this is almost like you're looking down on the top of someone's head, and you can see what we call a cross section of the eye. So here's your cornea, the kind of apex pointy part at the front top of the image. You have this kind of pink part extending in is actually the colored part of your eye, and it's around this pupil, which is circular. So again, this lens is landing out on this sort of peripheral tissue here, and because of this, it makes them really quite comfortable and stable, and they really provide good vision for people. So you're going to see a couple different types of images in this presentation, and it's from two sort of pieces of technology that we use to evaluate the scleral lenses. So the first is the slit lamp. Most of you probably can recognize this. You may or may not know it's called a slit lamp. It's essentially a microscope. You put your chin in this little area, forehead up against it. We ask you to look at something, maybe our ear, maybe a light, maybe, I don't know, something else. But we're basically taking a microscopic or high magnification image, looking at the eye. And so you'll see images taken from slit lamps. We often have cameras attached to these. If you've ever been in my clinic, you maybe have seen them, because I'll often show the images and videos to patients, because it can be kind of cool to see your own eye. This other one here is this OCT. It's called an optical coherence tomographer, if anybody's an engineer. This is basically using infrared light. I think the wavelength is about 1100 to scan. So it's kind of like a light scan, and it will basically create a much higher magnification sort of depiction of the cornea. It's not really an image per se, but it sort of gives you the structural capacity. And so you'll see images like that. And this is more kind of like a black box. You don't really know as much of what's going on inside that. If we look at two images from these instruments, right? So this is a slit lamp image. So again, just a higher magnified image, and it goes much higher than this. This is sort of the lowest magnification we can go to. You can see this patient is wearing a scleral lens. Here on the side, so this is an OCT image. So higher resolution, so we can see this is actually the cornea. So we're looking at essentially a cross section where you have the cornea is this tissue here. This is what we call the fluid reservoir, and this is what the scleral lens on top. So most of today's talk will really be about that fluid reservoir. We're going to talk a little bit more broadly because I do want to, I don't want the only people to benefit to be those who have this midday fogging, which is the title of the talk. So we'll talk a little bit about these different layers, but you're going to see some of these OCT images, and you can see, so this is the front of the lens here at the top of the image, the back of the lens. So again, if you're interested in sort of the size of these, so the scleral lenses are usually about 300 microns thick, so that's 3/10 of a millimeter. So very, very thin. The cornea itself is only about 0.5 millimeter thick, which is the same as 500 microns. And then this fluid reservoir here, which is where that fluid, everybody, when you're putting your scleral lenses on, so we tell you, make sure you've got, a full bowl filled with fluid, because otherwise when you put the lens on, you can trap air in this fluid reservoir, and that becomes very uncomfortable and can actually cause damage to the cornea. So many of you have probably had a bubble. We don't like bubbles. That's why we fill that bowl, that lens, with fluid, so that you'll just have fluid here between the lens and the cornea. Again, if we look kind of at our animation image in terms of this OCT, that OCT is kind of like taking a magnified image of just a section here. So what we're looking at, again, cornea, fluid reservoir, lens, you can see magnified down here. So most of us practitioners really love the OCT, because you can imagine, especially if you're into technology, it's a pretty cool tool to be able to really see what's going on at a high magnification with the lenses. So this is National Keratoconus Foundation, so well sponsored sort of for this webinar, because most patients in the United States, certainly wearing scleral lenses, have keratoconus. I bet if we surveyed the audience, I would say we have probably 55 to 60% of you, at least. That would be in a general population. Since this is a keratoconus sponsored webinar, it could be 95% of you guys. So here's a couple of images of keratoconus. So the main principle or main problem in keratoconus is this cornea grows very peaked and conical, so keratoconus. The Greek sort of origin of that is kerato, being cornea, Greek for cornea, and then conus as conical, so cornea, conical, keratoconus. The cornea can look highly irregular. You don't need to necessarily be highly trained to appreciate there's actually some sutures. This patient has like stitches in the eye. It's protruding out much more than it should. This is a patient who had keratoconus, who had a transplant. So many of you may also have a transplant on one or both eyes, or you might have this procedure called intacs. If we look at that OCT, again, here's a normal eye wearing a scleral lens, and you can appreciate this is a keratoconus cornea. So you can see in these high resolution images how peaked and kind of pointy that cornea gets in keratoconus. So this talk isn't about the optics of scleral lenses, but this is just a good opportunity to sort of point this out. You can imagine maybe that light hitting this surface here would kind of scatter a lot. It doesn't really form a nice clean image in the back of our eye, versus this normal refractive surface forms a clean image. So when you put this scleral lens on, the sort of top part of this scleral lens is essentially acting like an artificial cornea. So you can see when you do this, now when the light hits this surface, it has a much smoother path. And since this is plastic, this is fluid, and this is cornea, light passes through this whole structure kind of as if it's one single structure. So that's, in a nutshell, why optics of scleral lenses are so much better than glasses or even other types of contact lenses for people with keratoconus. There are other conditions. I'm sure there's some of you on here who have things other than keratoconus. Here's just kind of a list, not to leave anyone out. I'm sure even somebody's got something I don't list on here. This is a patient who has scars on their cornea from a procedure called radial keratotomy. If you know what that is, you know what I'm talking about. If not, if you haven't had it, you probably don't know what it is. There's also many dry eye diseases. These images here are probably a little bit harder to appreciate without more explanation, but I'm just kind of throwing them up there as a FYI, but I'm not going to go into these more kind of focus not so much on the different conditions. And, you know, if people have questions about any of these different conditions and how it relates to midday fogging, I'm happy to answer them, but I'll kind of just leave it at that. There's a lot of different, and there's really expanding indications or conditions that would indicate that a scleral lens could be helpful. So, you know, certainly the scleral lens wearing experience, and I actually wear scleral lenses myself, not full time, but a few days a week usually for a condition. So I like that because I can kind of empathize and appreciate some of these issues. So I'll throw in some of the things I've learned personally, but in general, most patients experience a much improved comfort and vision with contacts compared to maybe other types of contacts that they've worn, such as like one of the smaller diameter corneal lenses. And if you are one of the people that wears the smaller diameter kind of corneal bearing lenses, if you're doing well in them, great, keep going. But if you do have chronic issues with discomfort or lenses popping out, scleral lenses might be something that you'd ask your doctor about because you may be a candidate. But with any contact lens, you know, we're putting a rigid piece of plastic on the eye, so there's always this balance kind of pros and cons, right? So typically they have very good comfort, very good vision. Serious complications with them are pretty limited. We're doing a study right now to sort of look throughout the United States, what are the complications and when do they occur? But as far as we can see, mostly they're pretty much pretty minor, but sort of on the other side of that seesaw, they do require a little more specific care and handling. Most of you probably can appreciate this. There's different solutions for different stuff. You have to have all these tools. You kind of have to have like a little bag that you bring with you everywhere. So they do require some motivation and some investment. But hopefully one of the things that you'll take away from today is it's really worth just the extra couple of minutes of making sure you're cleaning the lenses properly, making sure you're, you know, applying them and removing them in a safe way, and storing them properly and using the right solutions for what, because it can really make a difference in your experience. And then there are some annoying complications that are relatively common. So one of those is midday fogging. So they're usually, you know, the pros of the lenses outweigh the cons, but certainly one of the more common complaints with scleral lenses, which is what we're going to talk about here, is my vision is foggy. And probably anyone who's worn scleral lenses has had at least one experience where your vision has been foggy with the lenses. So it's important to sort of break it down a little bit. And so if you're going to your eye doctor and asking them about this is kind of what they're going to do. They're going to say, okay, so you have this kind of fogginess, right? So there's a few different of the more common areas this can come from. So it can come from the lens surface, right? And again, to orient us, right, we've got front surface of the lens all the way at the top of this OCT image, and then back surface of the lens. I'm actually going to use a laser pointer just so that it's a little bit easier to see. Yeah. So again, we've got front surface of the lens here, back surface of the lens here, fluid reservoir, cornea. So the first thing is that front surface of the lens. And then we have the fluid reservoir, which is really what we're going to talk about with this midday fogging. You may be able to appreciate, but I'm going to show you several images on this, that there's kind of this particulate matter. Now, it's not, I don't see any particulate matter if I look over in the fluid reservoir in the OCT. So just keep that in mind. I'll show you some images where they do have it in there. And then the third, which is the most rare but also the most serious, is the cornea. So we'll talk about this. Is actually one of Dr. Lee's images. I didn't give you credit though, Dr. Lee. Sorry, I'm giving you verbal credit, I guess.
How dare you?
Yeah. So anyways, and that is a more serious issue. So, you know, I would say if you're getting this fogginess, again, just a caveat to everything I say today, you can try some of the tips and things I tell you, but if you really don't know what's going on, you kind of have to go in so somebody can look at it. Even if this was happening to me, for example, who I study these, I might still need Karen to take a look in the slit lamp so that I really know what's going on. So it's not just the expertise, sometimes it's the technology that you have to go in for. And just, again, those different layers. So lens surface. So we're kind of going to talk just briefly about the lens surface in the cornea so you can sort of have an idea of how we're going to delineate this and when we see you in the office, because some of this stuff you can troubleshoot on your own, of course. So first, the lens surface. So you can probably appreciate that this surface just kind of looks like globby and not wetting. This is very, very common for us to see. So this can be because the lens isn't being cleaned well enough, or it can just be because you're a heavy depositor. So it's not always, you know, your fault that you didn't clean the lens well enough, but you do want to clean the lens really, really well so you give the lens the best possible chance of sort of wetting well and not having this kind of lens surface fog. So it does kind of look like you're looking through a dirty windshield. So it might be like a little bit more diffuse. It might just be like a little part of your visual field. Typically, if you do a couple like hard blinks, it might be clear right when you open, but then it kind of fogs up again. That can indicate that you have something on the surface. And usually if you just remove the lens, clean it really well, you can sometimes even see, I often have patients I've had several pictures sent to me of like, yeah, you can see like white schmutz on the lens. You know, they're pieces of plastic that are treated to be sort of biologically stable. So they're what we call kind of ionic or a little bit charged. So stuff is going to stick to them. And in a way that's good because you want your tear film to stick and sort of be miscible on the surface. But you also want to make sure you're really cleaning lenses and getting all those proteins and lipids and things that get stuck on them every day when we wear them. Here's just an example, again, high magnification, some pretty bad deposits on the lens. So, you know, in terms of what's causing this, you know, we talked, sometimes this can be like a new lens, new material, not wetting. A lot of times it has to do with the solution use. So I'm putting up a slide here, and I will, maybe Karen, maybe we can, if there's any like burning questions or anything about like cleaning. I know I want to get more into midday fogging for at least 10-15 minutes. So maybe if there's nothing, I will just keep going. But first, just set it up a little bit. When you're cleaning the lenses, there are many different brands of solutions that you can use. I put a couple of the big and easily available ones here in the US up here. The Boston products have cleaners and conditioners. The Unique pH is kind of a multi-purpose cleaner and conditioner. The Clear Care is similar, kind of multi-purpose, but a kind of a special. You see the little cassette there. If you use Clear Care, you know what I'm talking about. Tangible Clean is also a multi-purpose. I put a little picture of what it can look like under the microscope when we get these like biofilms on the lenses. Some people like to use, you can get these on Amazon. Some people like to use these little like contact lens cleaning sponges, especially if you've got a really deep lens and you can't get your finger all the way into the bottom to kind of rub that lens. I tell patients, even if you're using Clear Care, you always want to rub the lens, loosen up deposits. But other than that, you know, I'm not really going to go super into this because I know everybody's got kind of a different, you could talk for hours about cleaning solution. So Karen, unless there's something burning, maybe we can, if there's time at the end and people have questions about solutions, what do you think?
Yeah, so, one good question we got, because you kind of touched on comfort initially on slide 9. So one of our listeners actually asked, are scleral lenses initially uncomfortable? Because her son actually wears lenses and he says it feels like a piece of gravel in his eye.
Yeah, so again, that's hard without seeing it. It shouldn't feel like a piece of gravel in the eye. When you first put in a lens, and this is true of any lens, but it can be particularly true of sclerals, it can take 10 to 15 minutes, truly 10 to 15 minutes for it to settle on the eye. So you are typically aware of it. If it feels like gravel in the eye, though, I would think, and you can see what you think too, Karen, I would say it's probably either really fitting like so that it's touching the cornea, which could cause a lot of discomfort, or he's getting a bubble every time. Karen, can you think of any like gravel in the eye? That sounds pretty uncomfortable. Kids can be a little bit, more dramatic. No, I don't want to say
Hmm.
dramatic, but a little bit more, sensitive in some ways, especially these like teenage boys. Sometimes, yeah, maybe a well-fitting lens, but I don't think I've had any of my teenage boys say a well-fitting scleral filled like gravel. Have you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that kind of makes me wonder how your son is putting the lens on too. Because if we're not careful, sometimes we can actually scrape the eye with the lens as we're putting it on. And maybe it's not a piece of gravel he's feeling. Maybe it's like a superficial cut that's happened and then it goes away with time. I love that you brought up bubbles because one of our other listeners asked about why they are getting bubbles in their lenses.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts
Yeah,
on that?
and I'll kind of answer that quickly, and then because actually I can touch on that a little bit when I talk about application solutions, because usually, so application bubbles are almost always, I would say, I can't think of a situation really that it's almost always just technique and how you're applying it. So I'm gonna actually hold on that because I do have a video of application. So I'll answer that in about maybe 5 to 7 minutes. How about? All right, I'm gonna keep going. So the other thing you may or may not have is a surface treatment called Hydropeg. Again, this is we're still on that surface of the lens, so it can work really well for patients if you don't produce many tears. I would say some people can be kind of sensitive to it. It can be deposit prone, so it's one of those things where when it works really well, but it doesn't work for everyone. So again, this is more something to kind of chat more with your doctor about. But I will say this doesn't do anything to mitigate midday fogging at all. It really has nothing to do with it. Some people will, there's some thought out there, I think there was anyways, that Hydropeg would affect midday fogging. It really doesn't. It has nothing to do with midday fogging because it's on the surface of the lens rather than being beneath. Okay. Cornea, I just bring this up kind of briefly. So corneal swelling or corneal edema um, is very rare. It's more common if you have a transplant. I've seen it maybe a couple of times in keratoconus patients, but you have this lens covering the eye, so it can reduce the oxygen that the cornea is getting and cause swelling. This is going to be kind of very different. The key here is if you have this fogging and it's accompanied by any discomfort or redness, and certainly if it doesn't improve when the lenses are removed, cleaned, reapplied, that's probably more serious, and so more important to kind of go see the doctor. Probably a lot of this troubleshooting, they may need to look more at the health of the eye. And this is just, again, that photo from Dr. Lee. These are kind of like bubbles on the cornea because you get like these little bubbles in the tissue when you have not enough oxygen. So just something to mention briefly. But with that, I'm going to talk, and the eye, will look pretty hot and red. So you'll usually know. I haven't had patients with bad corneal edema that didn't come in. So you usually know that this is a problem. So go in if you're experiencing that type of fogging. Okay, so to the fluid reservoir and the midday fogging. So again, if you look at this image here, you can kind of see particulate matter over over the front of the pupil. I actually took this picture about 3 hours ago, maybe no, about 2 hours ago, because we had a patient come in and she had the most beautiful midday fog. And Karen, doesn't this look good? Here in the
Oh
fluid
yeah.
reservoir, yeah, such a thick, cloudy, it's like milky looking. And I can truly empathize because this happens to me, not as bad as it happens to this patient, but it really looks kind of like this more diffuse fog. It usually takes a couple hours to come on. It's not really going to change when you blink. It has nothing to do with the front of the lens. And usually, many of you probably know this, you have to remove the lens and apply it with fresh solution. Even then, sometimes it kind of starts to come back immediately, but it's certainly a nuisance. And so this is actually, these are kind of some images just for those of you who nerd out like I do on some of these images. So again, I showed you the OCT images where that fluid reservoir was clear. You can see here it gets cloudy. So this is one of the ways, and we can see it when we look with the slit lamp microscope, which is are these two images in the middle where you can see this fog. But we can also confirm it with OCT. And I actually take these OCT images so that I can quantify it in my lab and study what it actually is. And it happens in about 20 to 30% of patients. So the two big questions that people have, right? Like, what is it in there? And probably you guys care more about this second question, which is, how do I fix it? Well, I'll tell you now, there is no magic fix for it, or else your doctor probably would have told you. But there are many, many things that both the doctor and you, mostly, that you can do as a patient to help mitigate it some. So I'm gonna go through this very quickly because I do want to more answer your questions, but I can't help but share a little bit of some of the research we have done in our lab. You can see with these OCT images on the left-hand side, the midday fogging scores kind of go up as you see that particulate matter. And actually, if you are one of my patients, I may have collected your tears because I do this in the clinic with patients. And essentially we take an OCT and I remove the lens kind of carefully, and you can see on that bottom left-hand image, I kind of pipette up that fluid and we can really do a lot with it. And so what do we see in there? I won't bore you with all the details of what we actually do, but essentially we evaluate the cells. This, what you're looking at here, is basically so not a slit lamp, a regular microscope. This is up in the basic science lab that I have up on the floor above the clinical, or 2 floors above the clinic. But basically, when we put these cells on a slide, we put these samples on a slide, and we stain them, we can see 2 primary cell types. So one, and I don't have one for comparison, but when you look at a non-fogging sample, there's no cells. You have to like really look for cells. So cells are a big part of what's causing that sort of fuzzy fog. So these larger cells are epithelial cells. They typically are sloughing off from your corneal epithelium as you wear the lenses. And then these other smaller little tiny cells there just look like little kind of purple dots, are granulocytes. So they're immune cells. They're one of the main, they're the most abundant type of immune cell that we have is called the neutrophil. If I kind of blow this image up here, you can see there's some variability, but basically all the small little ones. Again, if you're like a biology nerd or anything, you may or may not remember that these are one of the cells that has kind of what we call the tri-lobed nucleus. So if you've got keen eyes, you can kind of see there's a little dark tri-lobed nucleus in the middle of that cell as part of how we identify it as a neutrophil. So you've got these cells in the fluid reservoir. I could talk for hours about what they're doing there and why they're there, but it's not too concerning that they're there. To be honest with you, they're probably there for a protective reason. They don't seem to cause a ton of inflammation, but they are there. First step is kind of figuring out what they are. The other thing, and this is a little bit of a hard to digest slide, so I'm just kind of sharing it. Again, if you're interested in chemistry or science or anything, we did publish a paper on this. We also basically find a lot of nonpolar lipids, so lipids that don't mix well with water solutions in there. I won't go through this figure, but I will show you just a couple of quick graphs, and these relationships with the line kind of being positively correlated. So you can see as the midday fogging scores in these samples went up, so did these different 3 types of lipids. And probably these wax esters and cholesterols are probably coming from the glands in our eyelids, and these triglycerols are probably from those cell membranes from all those cells that were in there. Again, if you like chemistry, what do all of these have in common? They all have what we call long fatty acid tails. So that's sort of a common feature that you've probably you've got lots of things in your house that have this long fatty acids, including like the butter in your fridge, right? All these things that are oils, right? Definitely the oils. So they're not going to mix well with water. So it kind of makes sense that we have these like cells in the fluid reservoir, lots of epithelial cells. We also do have these immune cells in there, and this is when you're experiencing midday fogging. And then a lot of those lipids probably from the cells breaking down, and also coming from the glands in your eyelids. There's also some proteins. We've got we're doing some work on sort of inflammation and that sort of thing, but again, I wouldn't be worried about any of these findings. We're trying to figure out exactly what this means. You have these cells on the ocular surface anyways. They're pretty abundant in these fogging, but we don't see, if anything, it might protect you a little bit more from infection. So who knows, maybe midday fogging is protective, but it's still a nuisance, of course, right? So the next question really is, what can I do to improve this? So of course, and I'm going to kind of say this over and over again, but always consult. I'm just here to sort of share my experience and give you information. But it's hard. I don't know your case. I haven't seen most of your eyes, so talk to your doctor, help confirm it. And then if you're in Houston, you can always come see me. But otherwise, there's lots of really good scleral lens practitioners around the country. So in terms of what you can do, so application techniques, let's just I'm going to actually kind of skip this slide. So I'm just going to skip over to application techniques. So because people were asking about that. So first things, right, one of the things I said is some of these oils are coming from the glands in the actual eyelids. So for this and for the bubble reason that somebody had asked about, open the eyes nice and wide. So I usually tell people you want those eyes wide enough open so that you can fully see the kind of white perimeter around the colored part of your eye. That will ensure that the lens isn't going to hopefully interact much with the eyelids. You can imagine if you're like kind of hitting the eyelids along the way. That was another thing I thought about, Karen, with that question, is I've had some patients who will actually like hit their lids and trap like an eyelash under there, and the eyelash will come off and get stuck under there. That could certainly feel like a piece of gravel if you've got a sort of eyelash hanging out and it keeps touching the cornea. The other thing is overfill the bowl of the scleral lens. So this is going to ensure that you're not losing a lot of fluid, right? And we know a lot of that fluid kind of is going to drip down your cheek and get displaced as you put the lens on the eye. But hopefully, you can appreciate now from seeing those OCT images, you really can't have any air trapped in that pretty deep fluid reservoir. So more fluid is better. You're less likely to get a bubble. Yeah, so definitely do that. Gentle application. So will in general is going to irritate the eyelash. So one theme that I kind of talk about in a minute is touching the eye more can often exacerbate many of the issues that we have. So here's a video. I'm showing you a video of myself putting a lens on. So just, I kind of tip over. So I want my head to be parallel to the ground so that when and then you see I kind of I'll play that again. I kind of slowly bring the lens up on a level plane and I push it against the eye. Now, let's see, I can play that again. I'll play that one more time. And I'm happy to send, these are available online. If you go to the Scleral Lens Education Society website, the Dry Eye Shop has a website. There's lots of Facebook pages and things. I'll have my email at the end. So if you want any of these resources, I can also send you these slides if you want any of the text. But Again, just showing this video one more time. Hopefully the playback is okay, but essentially looking down, slowly bringing the lens up on a level plane, and just kind of gently, you want to bring it up onto the eye enough so that it's going to stay onto the eye. And actually, I was thinking today I might redo this video because in reality, it's sometimes it's nice when you kind of close your eyelids. Once you get the lens all the way up, you can kind of close your eyelids over the lens to help kind of bring it up onto the eye. We can talk more about that if there's questions, but I'm gonna sort of move on to, because honestly, putting the way you put the lens on doesn't have a lot to do with the midday fogging. It may be a little bit exacerbated, and some of you might have experienced this if you push the lens on really hard. But all in all, it's not one of the primary factors that affects it. One of the biggest things that I find can be helpful is in the application solution that you use. So sterile saline is the most common FDA, and I think it's FDA approved for just about all these solutions used for sclerals. Now, I will say FDA approval does not mean it cannot be used. We can use things off label, but I would caution you, do be very careful about discussing this with your doctor. And I'll give you some tips today, but there is sometimes a misconception like, oh, you can't use something if it's not FDA approved. Well, that's a process that companies go through so that, and it's good, they have oversight, and that they're sort of advertising for the indication that they have, but that's, it's sort of a gradual process. None of these were initially FDA approved, and then slowly the companies go through the process. So some of these solutions are buffered to neutralize the pH. Some are not. So these examples, many of you have probably used those little pink vials. We call them Addy packs. There's also one called Vibrant View. Those are not buffered. So the pH of those is about 5.5. Most patients are still okay with that, but some patients, I'm one of them, can experience a little bit of stinging, and we think it's because the pH is a little bit lower in those solutions. These other ones, we got a lot of patients that use PuriLens. There's also scleral fill and Lacropure. These are buffered saline. So they're salines, but they add boric acid and or sodium borate to buffer them. So these can be used generally as application solutions. There is one solution some of you might use is Neutrophil. This is buffered with phosphate, so it could be a little bit gentler and does have some nutrients in it. Now, there is some evidence, so those are just the regular solutions people use. If you have midday fogging, there is some evidence that some of these solutions with a higher viscosity and more nutrients in them, right? So they tend to be lipophilic, can reduce midday fogging. So what am I talking about with these solutions? Well, it's the off-label use, which many of us use. I was telling Karen, I stole these from, don't tell the clinic director, I stole these from the clinic today because I can't wear my lenses without using artificial tears. They just get irritated. I get midday fogging. No brands have actually been studied formally, so I throw some of them up here, but I promise the brand I'm using, the two brands I use, are not even actually on this list. So you can play around with different brands and think about it. But really important to consider if you do try to use these preservative-free artificial tears, you put them into the bowl of the lens. We often top it off with saline so that you still have a lot of fluid in there. The solution must be preservative-free, and I mean preservative-free by one of these little vials. Do not use these new multi-dose bottles. The big companies haven't had any issues, but there's already been 2 companies with those multi-dose vials that had contamination. So that's like my public service announcement. Be very cautious on using some of these multi-dose vials that are preservative free. We can talk about that with questions if you want. So just to kind of briefly share, because we are doing a study at UH that's actually looking at this use of an alternate application solution. So we did a pilot study. We had 4 participants. You can see saline versus we call them PFATs, preservative-free artificial tears. It did in this group reduce the amount of midday fogging. So that's kind of our pilot data. So we do, if you are in the Houston area and you have midday fogging, we're happy to enroll you in this study. You can try some of the different solutions and see what their impact is on midday fogging. And I have my email in here. I'll show it again later. We have a lot of studies. So if you have keratoconus and or wear scleral lenses and you're in the Houston area, or you come a lot to the Houston area, you may be interested. But I'm going to kind of just skip over lens hygiene because we talked about it already. There's really no evidence that lens hygiene is going to impact midday fogging, but for other reasons like the surface of the lens and just general comfort with the lenses, keep a clean, well-conditioned lens. You'll be a lot happier. Here's just an example, again, those OCTs with saline as the preservative and then as the application solution. So this patient didn't have really bad fogging. I still need to get a good image of someone who had really bad fogging. We're hopefully in this study we'll get it, but you can tell there's a little bit more debris in this fluid reservoir, and then when they use the preservative-free artificial tears, some of it goes away. So,
Dr.
yeah,
Walker, can I pause you for a second? So with
yeah,
that last slide,
huh?
oh, with the last slide, because it
Yeah,
actually works really well with this question.
yeah.
Somebody asked, should we increase the size of the reservoir or the vault to reduce how much fogging can happen?
Yeah, so the opposite, I think. So you want to reduce. So like what we'll do as the doctors is oftentimes this clearance will bring it down. So you might like cut this in half and bring the lens closer to the cornea, because then you have less fluid for that debris to accumulate. And maybe that's what you meant by the question. But yeah, you don't want more fluid in there. You want less fluid so that the fog layer is less dense, and also so that you there's other things that happen, like it kind of closes up this channel in the periphery where we think a lot of these cells are coming from. So if you sort of bring down the sort of channel between where the lens leaves the eye and starts to vault the eye, if that angle of touch is sort of less, it can reduce the movement of cells into the fluid reservoir. Okay, I think I'm almost done anyways, Karen, and then we can look at other questions. So eyelid and eye surface hygiene can play a big role, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this with questions. But if anybody's ever said you have blepharitis, meibomian gland dysfunction, dry eye, probably a lot of you would nod your heads. Yes, they're very common. Blepharitis is basically inflammation of the eyelids. Meibomian gland dysfunction is dysfunction of those eyelid glands that I was saying contributed to midday fogging. So they're what called wax esters and cholesterol esters, and if you have meibomian gland dysfunction and these oils are irregular, then they get trapped underneath the lens. They can create this. And so 2 questions that people have. Does having more debris in my tear film create more midday fogging, and does an eye wash in the morning help? Here's where I will say maybe the tear film, although I'm not sure there's much you can do about that with the debris. Does an eye wash in the morning help? Actually, probably not. That's sort of something we used to recommend, but since we actually had the eye wash in that pilot study and we didn't continue with it. I think the take home there is when you touch, and including rinsing really hard with something or washing the eye really kind of vigorously, when you touch the eye, you will cause usually more release of things like cells and inflammatory proteins. And again, this includes sort of aggressive eye drop use, I say. So if you just want to like rinse the tear film a little, maybe a couple like just gentle drops, let them run off, not like squirting the eye, because that can actually cause a little bit more. And then a couple just last tips and suggestions. What works for one person doesn't work for all. I was pretty vague on purpose about solutions and application solutions. If you want to email me and tell me your situation, if you're having issues, I get that quite a bit, and I'm happy to kind of try and help you. But as far as like telling you globally one solution works or another doesn't, it's different. So you got to try it out, what works for you. Allergies, dry eye, inflammation, all these things. If you have kind of red inflamed eyes, maybe talk to your eye doctor about getting that under control to help mitigate this. And again, I would emphasize touching, manipulating the lens. You know, a lot of in and out can sometimes, you may have experienced this, makes things worse more than it helps things. So yeah, so I'll flip it back to you, Karen, if there's any questions.
Yeah, yeah. So, one thing that you just brought up in your tips was the allergies. So, one of our listeners said they have severe fogginess and irritation, especially during the spring.
Yeah,
Maybe they have a pollen allergy.
yeah.
They're wondering, might it be a fit problem?
Yeah, so one key factor there is it's kind of flares up in the spring. But I'm imagining you're not wearing a different lens in the spring. So when we see something like that, it tells me, okay, well, when you're getting those flare-ups, that's more something that's going on with, irrespective of the lens. So probably, I haven't seen the lens, so it could potentially be fit to be less fogging. However, usually fogging is more of like a patient specific issue. You're going to have different lenses. You might have a little difference with some lenses, but it's pretty rare that patient has like fogging with every lens and then all of a sudden some new lens doesn't give them fogging. Now, the allergies in the spring causing the fogging leads me to believe probably this patient, the most of their fogging is from those cells. So when you have allergies, those neutrophils and also eosinophils, which are sort of the like sister of neutrophils, they flood onto the ocular surface, and it's probably that you're getting a ton of cells in that fluid reservoir.
Hmm.
So you can use there's actually over-the-counter medications to manage allergies. So probably the most popular one nowadays is Pataday. It comes in regular strength and extra strength. It's I sort of tell people it's kind of like Benadryl for the eye. It doesn't make you sleepy though. It's an antihistamine, so it will help to reduce that stimulus that's causing those cells to come out onto the ocular surface in the first place, and probably will
Hmm.
just make you more comfortable in general. When we're doing eye drops, medicated eye drops, like if I'm prescribing Pataday for a patient, I say, take it in the morning before you put the lens on, wait 5 or 10 minutes before you put the lens on, and then you can use it as soon as you take the lens off at night. You don't really want to be putting these in while the lens is in the eye because the preservative can get kind of underneath the lens and cause irritation. So same reason you wouldn't put a drop in and then immediately put the lens on, because then you're still going to have that drop on the surface and it gets trapped, and that can cause irritation.
Hmm. 100% agree. There was a lot of talk about cells tonight. Is there any literature to support that maybe if we change our diet, we can eliminate some of these cells?
Good question. I love it. Short answer is no. Long answer, actually, so Karen, I did a podcast with Sheila and Roya, Try Not to Blink. If anybody's into podcasts, it's not really geared towards patients, but they might have some patient stuff. I had actually a long conversation with them about diet and how it can contribute. So diet contributes to everything. Diet definitely contributes to levels of inflammation that we have in the body. There's actually, and I won't go into it here, but you can probably tell I've got, like, I don't even know what part to share with you because there's so much on it. But the gut actually has a lot of connections to the eye, right? There's a lot of cells that are communicating with both of the structures. They're both kind of mucosal tissues that have essentially access to the outer environment. So they both have what we call a microbiota, which is bugs that are normal, that are supposed to be on the eye, that help kind of maintain our ecosystem. Fun little quick fact for you: you have more bacteria, like non-human cells in your body, Karen, did you know this, than the cells you have that are your actual body, because you have
I believe
so many,
that.
like billions of bacteria, and they're so much smaller than our cells. So I'm not talking about bacteria that are bad. They're commensal bacteria. So our gut, our eyes, they're very prone to being sensitive to alterations in that, what we call the microbiome. So yes, what you can eat absolutely will affect it. So, eat right, green leafy vegetables, drink water, don't drink and smoke, you know, all the things that we say to do
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
for every part of health. But yeah, the eye is no different. I actually had a patient recently who used to have the most inflamed eyes. We could do anything, and they were just red. And he actually had a gastric bypass surgery, and then has just lost, a lot of weight in the past few years. His eyes looked so much less inflamed. I like couldn't get over it. So he was like my poster child for, he got his health really under control, and boom, that inflammation just really calmed down. So it was a nice visit for me to see him and to see, doing so well. So yeah, take good care of yourselves, and that, the eyes are part of the body. So
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. Another motivator for us to lose weight out there.
yeah, your eyes will, you'll have less day fogging. Who does that
Yeah,
study? I don't want to do
yeah.
that study.
You kind of mentioned, minimally touching your lenses. So one of our listeners asked, can cotton swabs be used to clean the lenses instead of the fingers, and will that help?
So kind of a loaded question. So like, would I recommend you do it? No. Would I do it myself? Yes, because because the problem is the cotton swabs are kind of like tissues where it's like wood products. So if you're using that every day and you're too rough with it, you can scratch the inside of the lens. So you can do it. It will clean it up. But you might kind of affect the longevity of the lens. I might get those little sponges, those little contact lens sponges. You have to be a little careful on, making sure you're cleaning them. I'd clean them well with like alcohol, or, get a bunch and dispose of them every few days, or something. See what works for you. But the cotton swab, yeah, like in a pinch, if you've got schmutz in there that you need to get out, you can use it, but be gentle, like really gentle. I don't know, maybe there's some brand of cotton swabs that are like not wood, but I don't know what's going on. There's like bamboo. I know there's bamboo ones. I had those for a while, but that's still wood, woodish. But no, general
Yeah, definitely
recommendation,
still
right?
would.
Our general recommendation. But is it going to scratch it the first time you do it? No, it's just over time it could scratch it. So we're careful on that recommendation. But with my lenses, if
Hmm.
I need to give them like a good clean, I don't hesitate to sort of gently give it a little swirl with my cotton swab.
Hmm. So one of the words that we heard you using tonight was wetting, and I think that's like a common word thrown around in the optometry world. How do we describe wetting to our listeners? Like, what is wetting?
Yeah, so wetting is so actually, was it you who was showing me your windshield recently? Somebody was showing their windshield. Basically you want the
Mhm.
lens to be the opposite of what you want your windshield to be. So like when you get the like no stick stuff put on your windshield and the water beads up on it, it's because the water is not able to like spread a coating over that piece of glass. When that happens with a lens, that's non-wetting, right? When the water can't sort of spread evenly over the lens. And it will happen when there's like oils on the lens. So if you're handling the lenses a lot and you didn't wash your hands, we've got so many oils on our fingers. If you put your makeup on and then you're all of a sudden handling your lens, you're gonna probably get a big old fingerprint on there. That's not gonna wet because you're gonna now have created this kind of like oily surface on the top of the plastic. So um, it's basically when there's usually an oil. Sometimes like when you get a new lens or a lens is dry, it has to be like nicely conditioned because it's a piece of plastic, right? You have a plastic, any piece of plastic you have in your home, like you put water on it, sometimes it spreads nicely, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the lenses are treated so that, like I think I mentioned that they're kind of ionic or charged, right? So they kind of, it's almost like when you rub together the things to get the static charge, you kind of want a little bit of that on the lens. So they'll actually treat it so that it'll do that. But lenses are made because the material is actually put on a wax block, and then the material is kind of cut from there. So then it comes off this wax block. So sometimes there's not like wax on it, but sometimes like microscopically there can be like some residual so that it doesn't wet well when you first get a new lens. Most of those issues are solved by the fact that the lab treats them so that they'll wet well. But if you're
Hmm.
not cleaning them well enough and you're not getting rid of those oils, you're not washing your hands, you're not getting, I always tell patients when you're cleaning it, get it sudsy, get the solution that you're using to clean it sudsy. Because it's like the dishes in your sink. And I think on one of my sites, I even have dish soap on there because we used to use dish soap sometimes. If you've got a really stubborn deposit and you run out of cleaner, grab some dish soap,
Hmm.
use that. You don't really want to use that every day, but you know, it can really help break down those oil deposits and get the lens clean. Now, if you're if you are using my little dish soap trick, make sure you then are, you know, rinsing the lens well and putting a nice like contact lens conditioner on. The other little thing I use, which the analogy works better with women than men usually, but you know, it's kind of like your hair. Like there's two-in-one conditioner, and then there's shampoo and conditioner separately. And the two-in-ones, yeah, they get the job done. But if you want like silky smooth hair, for most of us anyways, you want that specific conditioning step because it really helps kind of make it smooth.
So I love the windshield analogy, just like how driving with a dirty windshield would be pretty tough to see. Wearing a lens that is dirty probably is pretty tough as well to see through also. Since we're on the topic of driving, one of our listeners said, I have trouble driving at night. Is this because of my contact lenses, midday fogging, or just my keratoconus?
Probably the last, so probably the keratoconus. It's not unusual, especially as we get more mature in age, to experience blur at night. What's happening when you're driving at night is your pupil, it's dark out, right? So your pupils are going to get bigger. When they get bigger, they start to let in more stray light. And if you have keratoconus, you know, I showed some of those pictures with the kind of wonky looking cones. If you have scars, you get light that scatters off that. So
Hmm.
it's not uncommon to sort of, you know, look up at the street lights and see more of a halo and notice it more at night. Now, extreme examples, there actually are eye drops that can bring the pupil size down. Um, Again, I've done this a handful of times. Sometimes it works really well. Sometimes patients don't really notice a difference, but some people will. It's a drug, yeah, it's basically a medication that's often used for treating glaucoma. But it's very safe on the eye, so it's pretty, we don't usually have a problem using it. So I'll have patients that, you know, will use it maybe if they're driving at night. They don't use it every day, just maybe if they're driving at night, sometime they can take it, you know, an hour or two before. But again, that's kind of an extreme. I know, Karen, you've maybe done that a couple
Hmm.
times too. It, you know, sometimes it works if somebody's really experiencing bad halos at night.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and the other thing too is nowadays, I don't know how sophisticated your lenses are, but we are sort of in the emergence of using what we call higher order aberration or wavefront guided lenses, which can help correct some of those really kind of subtle irregularities in the cornea that can be affected at night. So at night, again, your pupil's getting wider, so you're more susceptible to some of the sort of residual irregularities of having keratoconus. The scleral lenses correct probably 90 to 95% of the corneal irregularities, but there's some of them in the standard lenses that aren't corrected. But these wavefront guided lenses, basically, it's almost like I tell patients sometimes, it's almost like your lens is a little bit more like a soccer ball than it is like a basketball. Like it's got all these kind of intricate little almost lenslets in it that just correct vision at a much higher level and much sharper. Again, at Houston, we've got a study going on right now where we're testing these they're called higher order aberration correcting scleral lenses in patients with keratoconus. So you get free
Hmm.
lenses out of that one. So again,
Hmm.
I'll use that to sort of skip ahead, and just because I see some people are leaving. So yeah, of course, feel free to hop off. I'm going to leave this slide up. I know Karen will introduce the next webinar. My email is on here as well. So if anybody has any questions or issues, I'm happy to stay on and answer a few more
Yeah.
questions or whatever you want to do, Karen.
So there's really only two more questions. This one I think is a good one. You mentioned that you use preservative-free artificial tears in the bowl of your lens. So do you fill the entire lens with preservative-free artificial tears? What should our listeners do?
Yeah, that's a great point, and actually a really important point. So I'm going to take out my little tear here. You'll tell me if you can't see me, and I don't know how much my demonstration will help. So yeah, so that is the biggest issue with it, is because you've got one of these little vials. You want to use one per lens. So the first thing, it seems straightforward, but like I'll tap it down because sometimes you'll get little micro bubbles in here. I'm not going to open this because I need to use it tomorrow morning. But, and then you kind of take it when it's down and you'll just kind of drip this into the lens. Now, with the lens, you're going to see it's not going to form this kind of meniscus over the top when you're just dripping this in. So depending on how good you are at applying your lenses, if you can get the whole thing in, I usually save like the very last drop and just put it right in my eye, because the very last drop will sometimes get bubbles into the bowl of the lens. So, and you'll get better at doing it. So you put basically the whole one in, and then if you have trouble with application, then drip, drip, drip your saline. Now don't like squirt your saline because then you'll get a bunch of bubbles in. So drip, drip, drip your saline on the top. It should stay relatively separate because the artificial tear is a little more dense. And then if
Mhm.
you put your lens on, most of that saline is going to spill over and you'll be left with mostly the artificial tear in the bowl of the lens. If you're, I do have some patients who are just, they want to make sure it's only artificial tears. You can use 2 of these per lens and just fill it up until you get a really high full bowl of the lens. I'll tell you what I do. I'm pretty good at putting in the lenses, but honestly, sometimes with my left eye, I still get a bubble, but I'm pretty quick out and in, so I don't worry that much about it. But if I use one of these, it's kind of just enough so that if I'm just careful and I put the lens in, I have no problems. I don't get any bubbles. But as many of you probably know, there's always one eye that's, you're like,
Mhm.
I just always get a bubble in this one eye. For me, it's my left eye. It just, for whatever reason, my coordination isn't the same on that eye. So sometimes with that one, I'll put a little bit more in. But yeah, experiment with it a little. You don't have to fill it to that meniscus, but you certainly can fill a lot. It's not cheap. You'll go through it pretty quickly.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Walker. I felt like we all learned a lot today about midday fogging. And for everybody out there, we're hoping to see you in 2 months, November 14th. That's another Tuesday. We're going to be learning from the Save Sight Keratoconus Registry with Dr. Stephanie Watson. Thank you again for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Walker.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good night.